FIA incompetence. We as Formula One fans know it. We as Formula One fans do not love it. Countless errors over recent seasons, beefing with Formula One drivers, and new stupid regulations have led to mounting pressure on the FIA from fans, which culminated in getting roasted by Gordon Ramsay at F1's own event and then subsequently getting booed by the fans.
The FIA has been instrumental in their efforts over the last...
However, the FIA bringing in silly new regulations is unfortunately not just a new thing. In fact, there are some absolutely horrible rules, regulations and formats that the FIA have brought in over the 75 years of Formula One. So in this video, we're gonna have a little chat about them, we're gonna have a little laugh about them, and we're gonna learn about the worst of the FIA in their history. Our story begins in the 1950s, heading right back to the inception of Formula One itself. And if I'm to be honest, I haven't got a clue what I'm talking about when it comes to the 1950s. Call me Michael Massey at the 2021 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, because I've got no idea what's going on and I might just start making it up. Rules and regulations were a lot different back then. Safety, definitely not #1 priority.
Safety is #1 priority.
Sustainability, that just hadn't been invented yet. So the entire scape of Formula One itself looked incredibly different. Drivers would go into each race knowing that there was a risk of end of life, and that was deemed an acceptable way of going about things at the time. And the risks are, of course, still there now. However, safety regulations have come in over the years which are important and have changed how we view things today. However, the first rule I actually want to cover is not one surrounding safety. It is that drivers used to be able to swap cars mid-race. Your car breaks down when you're leading the race? Not to worry, we'll just pull you into the pits, pull in your teammate, swap cars, and then you can get in that one and go on and continue in the race. It's absolutely mental. Could you imagine this nowadays? Australian Grand Prix this weekend, Max Verstappen's out front, his car breaks down, they bring in Liam Lawson, tell him to get out the car, Max continues on and goes on to continue in the race. It's absolutely mental stuff. This very rule actually helped the legendary Juan Manuel Fangio win the title in 1956. He effectively had to finish in second in that race to win the championship against Stirling Moss. His car broke down, they brought in his teammate, he swapped cars, he went on to finish second in that race and subsequently win the 1956 championship. Unfortunately, I am no F1 historian as much as I wish I was. I couldn't find too much information on this being a rule or a regulation in Formula One, and I couldn't find a specific date at which it was outlawed. However, it seems that the last time that it happened in a race was in 1964 with Jim Clark for Lotus. But let me know down in the comments if you know anything more about this very bizarre regulation that definitely wouldn't pass in modern Formula One. Another rule that used to exist in classic Formula One was the dropped scores system. Effectively, throughout a season, not every single one of a driver's results would contribute to their final season tally. Their worst results throughout the season would be dropped. Between 1950 and 1966, between 4, 5 and 6 races would count in 7 to 11 race seasons. This was because reliability just did not exist like it does in Formula One today. We see in most races these days, maybe 1 or 2 cars dropping out of the race due to reliability, whereas back then it was most cars dropping out of each race due to reliability. So this system was effectively in place so that luck and misfortune played less of a role in the championship standings at the end of the season. Between 1967 and 1980, the season was split into 2 halves, and the worst result from the first half and the worst result from the second half would be dropped from each driver's scores. And then from 1980 to 1990, when the rule was then scrapped, it was 11 races out of a 16 race season that would count towards the final tally. This rule did result in a very interesting 1988 season though. Alain Prost over the course of the whole season scored 105 points, whereas Ayrton Senna scored 94. However, after dropped points were taken into consideration, Ayrton Senna dropped to 90 points and Alain Prost dropped all the way to 87, meaning that Senna won the championship despite Prost having more points over the season. It's safe to say that consistency over a full season was not valued as much then as it is now in Formula 1. So is this rule really that dumb? I feel like no, because at the time the reliability was such a massive factor in Formula 1, but if it was to be implemented now, I feel like it would make absolutely no sense. It's definitely something that's better left in the past. We move now to 2005, where the FIA implemented a regulation that stated that the teams must use one set of tyres across qualifying and the entire race. No tyre changes whatsoever. Which is kind of crazy to think about in an era now where we have mandatory pit stops, and even 2 mandatory pit stops at the Monaco Grand Prix this year, which we will talk about later. But in 2005, you could only pit if you had a puncture or if it started raining. And even if you did have a puncture, you could only replace that one tyre, you couldn't replace the full set. This rule was effectively brought in to stop Ferrari dominance. After 5 seasons of back-to-back championships with them and Michael Schumacher, it was clear that the FIA had had enough and so implemented this rule. The reason that this rule affected Ferrari more than any of the other front-running teams is because at this stage in Formula 1, there was 2 different tyre manufacturers, Bridgestone and Michelin, don't know how to say it. Ferrari's Bridgestone tyres were softer than the Michelin tyres, which meant that they were faster over shorter periods of time, but also wore out quicker, which meant that Ferrari's best strategies in most races, up until this point, was to pit multiple times, shorter stints, therefore run on lighter fuel at the time, and also just have that softer rubber so that they could go faster over those stints. So when this rule came into existence, the Michelin tyres became the preferred tyre to be on because they were harder, therefore could last longer, therefore could last the whole race. But this rule was effectively the sole cause of that horrible US Grand Prix where only 6 cars lined up on the grid. The Michelin tyres, despite being the harder of the 2 options for the teams that season, were not appropriate for the banked corner at Indianapolis. It meant that all the teams who were running those tyres came into the pits at the start of the race, and because they couldn't change tyres mid-race, they couldn't last the full race, and so they just didn't take part at all, because it was just too dangerous for the drivers to risk it. Fortunately, this rule was only in place for 1 season and then it was scrapped. It was very dumb. Another rule implemented for 2005 was aggregate qualifying. It seems that substance abuse was absolutely rife in the FIA offices moving into this season because this is yet another very dumb regulation. Thankfully, this one didn't even make it past round 6. Qualifying is something that they absolutely love to tinker with in Formula 1. And this season was no exception. The drivers would do 1 lap on Saturday afternoon on light fuel, and then they would do 1 lap on Sunday morning on race fuel, and then add them together, and bang, that is your lap time for qualifying. The issue was that effectively the Saturday qualifying and the Sunday qualifying would generally generate the same result, meaning that the Saturday session almost just seemed like a spoiler to Sunday, and there was no real excitement generated by this system. As I mentioned, this qualifying format did not make it past round 6 in 2005. No one liked it, and thankfully, we now have our qualifying format that we have today, which was implemented from 2007. But it wasn't without a lack of trying from the FIA. They did make a couple of implementations since then, which we will get onto later. In 2007, new regulations were brought into effect around the safety car. Effectively, when the safety car came out in the race, the pit lane would be completely closed until the entire pack had formed up to the back of the safety car. If you were to pit in this window, then you would receive a 10-second stop-go penalty. Now, all we need to do is add in some refueling, and this regulation immediately starts to tumble down. It ended up just being a way too harsh penalty, simply just for being unlucky with the timing of the safety car coming out. Say, for example, you start the race with 15 laps of fuel planning to pit at that time, and then the safety car comes in on lap 13. It makes no sense to continue on and run out of fuel, but then you also can't come into the pits, otherwise you will get a penalty. This happened a few times throughout the 2007 season, with Rubens Barrichello, Nick Heidfeld and Robert Kubica all coming a cropper due to this rule. And then in 2008, it left the door open for what is probably the biggest scandal in Formula 1 history. If you're not familiar with Crashgate, then I'll leave an excellent video on it by Josh Ravel in the description. Highly recommend watching it if you're wanting to get any more knowledge on the topic. But effectively, Alonso won the race because no one else could pit under safety car after he made an early stop, and therefore they kind of race fixed, and it was a bad time. Thankfully, from 2009 onwards, this rule no longer existed, and it brought in our current pit delta system that we have now, which means that drivers need to travel around the track at a certain pace when the safety car comes out to be safe around crashed cars and also to keep it as a level playing field. And I think that currently it is a pretty good system. It still results in drivers getting lucky and unlucky from the safety car, but I think that that introduces some good strategy, because if you go long on a stint, then it can benefit you if the safety car comes out, yada yada yada. You get the picture. Our next regulation, team orders. Love them or hate them, team orders are a part of Formula 1. Other than when they weren't. After the 2002 season, where Ferrari utilised team orders a bit too much for the FIA's liking, including that Austria race where they let Michael Schumacher pass Rubens Barrichello literally on the line, kind of nullifying the race result. The FIA had had enough, and team orders were banned from 2003 onwards. The issue was, though, that teams would still want their preferred driver to be in front at any given time, whether it be to overtake the car in front or if the championship is on the line for certain positions. So they would continue to use team orders, but just not make it so blatantly obvious. And the rule did last for 8 full seasons. However, that not so blatantly obvious part that I mentioned before, yeah, at Hockenheim in 2011, Ferrari threw that one out of the window with the infamous "Fernando is faster than you." And at the end of that season, the FIA decided that team orders would be re-allowed in Formula 1, which has given us some great times. Valtteri at James, and whatever happened with McLaren and Lando Norris at Hungary last year. We moved to 2014 now, where they introduced double points for the final race. It sounds like something straight out of a video game. And it was the brainchild of none other than Bernie Ecclestone, who had clearly not skipped his Weetabix that morning. He said it would make the end of the season more intense. If someone was 150 points behind with 3 rounds still to go, then they still had a chance at winning the championship, which I guess was true. And in 2014, the only season that we've ever seen this rule implemented, the title race between Hamilton and Rosberg did indeed go down to the wire in Abu Dhabi. However, it would have gone down to the wire anyway, even if it wasn't double points for the last race. What it did mean was that Hamilton had to finish second or better if Rosberg were to win the race, whereas normally he would only have had to have finished 6th in the race or better if Rosberg were to have won the race. In the end, none of that mattered because Hamilton went on to win the race and with it the championship. However, this rule was met with an absolute barrage of negativity. Choose any Formula 1 driver from that season, or choose any F1 legend, and they will likely have some sort of quote about this rule just being completely trivial and nonsensical. Thankfully, that was the last time that we ever saw double points. In 2016, the FIA decided that engineers would no longer be allowed to instruct drivers about their cars during the race. This is definitely up there as one of the worst. It was essentially brought in to stop engineers micromanaging the drivers by telling them the perfect gear to take in every single corner, how to take it perfectly, essentially making it more up to the driver to optimize how they drove the car during the race. However, what happens when the car stops working? Well, in Silverstone that year, with Nico Rosberg, we saw exactly that. Effectively, Nico's gearbox stopped working properly. The team told him to change the engine modes, which was deemed acceptable, but then the team also told him to shift through 7th gear instead of using it, which was deemed not acceptable, and thus he was given a 10-second penalty at the end of the race, which dropped him from P2 down to P3 behind Max Verstappen. When asked about the rule that had just directly benefited his own team, Christian Horner said it was a horrible rule, and that tells you just about everything you need to know about it. It also affected Lewis Hamilton that year in Azerbaijan, who drove around for half the race not knowing how to fix the car. Thankfully, the rule only made it to Germany that season, round 12, and we've never seen it again. Elimination qualifying was also brought in 2016. They were absolutely cooking that season with stupid formats and regulations. Qualifying has been touched on in this list already. However, this one is arguably the worst qualifying format we have ever seen. Despite the current format being the one that we have had for such a long time, the FIA still seem to be desperate to tinker with it, and they did so in 2016. Effectively, qualifying starts as normal in Q1. However, after 7 minutes, the driver in last place would be eliminated from qualifying, no longer allowed to set a lap. And then after every 30 seconds after that point, another driver would get eliminated until we were down to 15 remaining runners. This then repeated in both Q2 and Q3. When this was introduced at the first race of the season in Australia, it went down like an absolute lead balloon, because no one had enough time to react to being in last place. In Q3, there was literally no drivers on track for the final 4 minutes of the session. It just absolutely killed the hype. Nowadays, we see every single driver heading onto the track for the last lap in Q3. It's an absolutely beautiful crescendo to the end of the session, but when everyone's getting eliminated, it just can't happen like that. It was such a bad format that the FIA agreed with the teams that it would no longer exist going into the next race in Bahrain. However, they just went ahead and did it anyway. It fell flat on its face once again, and thankfully we've never seen it in Formula 1 since. Banning helmet changes mid-season. You know how we get to see excellent one-off special helmet designs for races that mean something to drivers, or just because they like the track and they want to have a cool helmet for that weekend? Well, render yourself lucky, because between 2015 and 2020, this was banned in Formula 1. Why? Because F1 decided that the drivers needed to be more recognisable in the car. Like, as if you're not going to be able to recognise your favourite drivers because of, let's say, the car they drive. It was really just a direct shot at Sebastian Vettel, who was known for his weird and wonderful helmet designs in the early 2010s. Vettel spoke out against the rule, saying that he didn't really know why it had been brought in, and he didn't know what the penalty was, but if the penalty was to just be donating some money to charity, he'd probably just go ahead and do it anyway. Lewis Hamilton posted an Instagram story about it, saying that it was BS and asking fans if they agreed. They did. And Danny Kvyat tried to wear a special helmet for his home race in 2019 at the Russian Grand Prix and wasn't allowed to do so, called the rule a joke. I'm personally very glad that this rule got ousted in 2020, because we get to see some great helmets from the drivers these days, including this absolute corker from Alex Albon. Just absolute nonsense. Short race rules. I'm specifically talking about Spa 2021 here. I won't spend too long on it because we all know what happened that day, but it was an absolute joke. To have a race that only lasted for 2 laps, and those 2 laps just be behind the safety car, and that be within the rules, is just absolutely mental. Couple that with the fact that F1 fans that were there for that weekend, for the Sunday, didn't get any refunds and were just offered like F1 TV packages instead, even though they didn't see a single car race. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. Thankfully, the rules have since changed. The race does have to happen not behind the safety car for drivers to get points. But yeah, that was just an absolute shambles. The jewellery ban was brought in 2022 and did exactly what it said on the tin. Or silver, or gold. Little science joke for you guys. It was effectively just a rule brought in to stop Lewis Hamilton existing. So he turned up to the next press conference literally wearing like 15 watches, 20 chains, looked absolutely hilarious, all in protest of what was a pretty stupid rule. Just a bit of a dumb rule, quite a weird thing for the FIA to try and clamp down on when there are other issues in Formula 1 that they should maybe be focusing on. And after some initial threats to Lewis about wearing his jewellery, it kind of seemed to die down, and it doesn't really seem like it's in place anymore. We're now moving into the section of the video where the rules are still in effect, or they are coming into effect for this following season. And let's just say there are some incredibly dumb ones in here. Like a penalty for using intermediate tyres on a track that is wet because the FIA haven't yet deemed the track to be wet. Charles Leclerc was given a penalty in Canada last year because he used intermediate and the FIA hadn't yet indicated that the track was wet, even though it was raining. It's absolutely mental. I couldn't really find any information as to whether there was any sort of ramifications after this event, whether they have stopped this rule from existing or anything. I think it still is in effect. It's just so stupid. The next one is equally stupid in my opinion. The fact that the number 13 is banned. Technically not banned in Formula 1 itself, I will say that. We have only ever seen one driver using the number 13 though, and it is Pastor Maldonado. However, the reason that it is in the now section is because in Formula 2, Formula 3, and the Formula 1 Academy, the number 13 is not in existence. The numbers go from 11, 12, to 14, 15. It just seems all a bit trivial to me that surely in the pinnacle of motorsports and the series leading up to it, that something like number 13 wouldn't matter so much, but I guess if a driver were to step into that car and start being unlucky, then they probably would put it down to superstition. But yeah, bit of a strange one for me. No permanent stewarding. George Russell called for it last year to increase consistency from race to race as to how the stewards look at each individual incident. Mohammed Ben Sulayem, the current president of the FIA, says that the FIA do not have the money to fund it, which is just absolutely mental at the pinnacle of motorsports. This has been the case forever. No permanent stewarding is kind of supposed to make the stewards more impartial to every single situation and remove like one group of people being biased towards one particular driver or team over the course of an entire season. But what we really need is just to have a group of people with their biases known and them be the permanent stewards. There's no point in having this sort of tipsy-topsy-turvy system that we currently have. We move on now to rules and regulations that are brought in for this specific season. We're starting off with the famous no swearing rule, which is just completely nonsensical. I obviously talked about it in the intro with Gordon Ramsay saying at the F1 Live event that it was pointless. And it is entirely pointless. I don't really know why the FIA are so focused on swearing, considering the fact that it is a high-octane sport. The drivers are, of course, going to react to things in different ways. The fines are exorbitant. The fact that it's going to affect race results, potentially, if drivers get penalised for it, it just makes absolutely no sense. The next regulation for this season that I think is a bit weird is the fact that the flexi-wing rules are changing after round 9 rather than just at the start of the season or at the end of the season. We saw it in testing a few weeks ago. Teams are pushing the limit on how far the front wing flexes to increase top speed on the straights, and then it will come up slightly to increase downforce in the corners. And this is absolutely fine. Teams pushing the limits of the regulations makes sense in Formula 1. However, for it to then get outlawed at round 9 of the season just makes absolutely no sense. Teams are either going to optimize their entire package around the front wing up until that point, or they're going to try and optimize what the regulations will be after that point. Why wouldn't it just come in at the start of the season, or just leave it until the end of the season when we've got an entire new technical regulation anyway? It just makes absolutely no sense to me. And the final regulation for this season that I think is a bit dumb is the Monaco 2 pit stops being mandatory. Obviously, they're trying to make Monaco be a bit more of an interesting prospect in the race itself, but I think if you're going to leave Monaco on the calendar, then stop trying to manufacture something out of it. We all know as Formula 1 fans that when you're watching the Grand Prix weekend, the Saturday matters the most. Qualifying is always going to be what matters most, and I don't think that introducing 2 pit stops is going to change anything in the race. It just makes it all feel a bit too manufactured, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So, with all that, that was all of the worst dumb regulations that the FIA have implemented. The worst part about it though is that these were all of the ones that were intentionally brought in. I didn't even cover the rules that they brought in and then broke themselves.